Thanks for coming. I have actually taken the assignment of Bo very literally, and I wanted to talk about some key concepts of this book that I wrote, and I've written actually a lot of things before that, but the book kind of puts everything together. And I hope that those who have read it, they probably should not, they can sleep for a moment. Those who have not, I hope that creates some discussion later on, and well, I hope that we can discuss things. So I want to talk briefly, start with simply saying what are the challenges, in my opinion, about design, of designers, and how design should redefine itself. What are the real problems that we are facing? And then go into the question of what are the objects that we design? And my suggestion is that they increasingly become language-like and no longer physical kind of qualities. Then I'm looking at the kind of role that the designers play in the world, in society. And then you go through several kinds of what I consider myths, like the myth of the user, the issue of do designers in fact design products, or what do they do when they design something? And a key phrase is actually, to me, I think meaning matters in this whole business. And you said correctly, one of my earlier titles was design is making sense of things, and I would say design is making things that are meaningful to other people. And then I talk about several kinds of theories of meaning, and in the end I would like to make a plea for well, how design make themselves relevant in this world. So I will start with the kind of a trajectory of artificiality, or the kind of things that designers have been dealing with. Now, of course, products. We know that very well. And products have a peculiar, in our way of dealing things, they have utility. They have functionality, and they have universal standards, universal aesthetics. That's the way, at least when I studied design, that was kind of the standard way of thinking, that everyone should use the same object in the same way, that functional design, etc., etc. But I think this has changed quite a bit, and I want to go quickly through some of the changes that I think take place within the object of design. In the 1950s, we realized that, well, not we, but some people realized that objects are not really the issue. The issue is to make them sellable, to make them aesthetically pleasing, to market them, and suddenly they were no longer a product, rather than a good that could be sold, or the identities of companies that are important, or her own notion of information design, etc., etc. So it becomes a little less material, the kind of object of design, and we do this kind of thing still. But then comes the issue of interfaces. To me, I mean, we know the interface best, I think, by computers, and computers are good examples of the kind of things that we have absolutely no clue what's going on inside, but we can nevertheless handle it. And what designers do are not designing the interior. Good engineers can do that, but designers, or what I say human-centered designers, have to deal with how one handles this. In fact, if you think of, for example, Steve Jobs as a good example, and since he died recently, there was so much written about him. But he started out with Steve Wozniak in a garage in California, to say everyone should use a computer. Now, I have to say, while they were thinking, I was starting to learn to program Fortran 4 and with numbers and so on. I couldn't understand why anyone would grind numbers, But they had an idea of doing something that everyone could use. And the idea here was the interface is all that matters. So he developed basically the notion of clicking and moving objects, and so that started moving in the direction of now designing really interfaces rather than the technology behind technology behind comes afterwards, usually comes afterwards. So, but then there are other kinds of interesting design projects, such as services or multi-user interfaces or networks. For example, the internet, inventing new kinds of groups to discuss, or Facebook is a good example, based actually on the internet, which is a very primitive code actually, but it allows a fantastic number of products, one could say, facilities, practices to be designed. They're not interfaces alone. They are not interfaces between one human being and a machine, rather between one human being and a machine and many, many others. So that is a very different kind of design project to deal with many people. The issue is one of information, of social connectivity, and individual accessibility of these products. So this is a very different kind of design object that designers more and more have to deal with. Then there's another one, that of products, of projects. A project is something that deals with people. Now one doesn't design people, but one designs tasks that people can perform and work together to get something done. And in fact, I would say even a design project is a project. You have to work with other people, and we will talk in a minute about this. So it is a project that needs to be fed by ideas, and people need to be working together, and the result is something that they are all satisfied with. And then there is another kind of thing that interests me particularly, and this is discourses. I will talk a little bit later about language. To me, I think the language is kind of the mother trope of ecology, and that is where we live in. And so I think designers ought to redesign their own language in order to design better. So that is the issue of discourse. And there is an issue of re-articulability. That means that one must be able to speak that discourse, one must be able to manifest solidarity, etc., etc. These are different kind of criteria. And when you compare it with what most people have been doing, and actually I saw some of the objects that were exhibited, many of them had very concrete objects, products, potential products. And I think the issue is really to move away from that, move towards interactivity, move to social relevance, move towards how people can interact with each other, and some have in fact that element also. So I think the conclusion one can draw from this kind of development is that the product forms increasingly dissolve into interactivity, into language-like objects. And maybe we should really move away from being totally focused on shapes and colors and tactile things, even though I'm not saying that's unimportant, but it is not all that there is. So looking at the same type of thing from a different kind of perspective, one can say that the products were the result of a low diversity industrial culture, where in industry, 100 years ago, there was very little diversity, a few producers trying to produce mass objects. And this was, I think, undermined by market economy, which increased the number of choices that people had. And there was a kind of cultural criteria started to become dominant as we move on. And then languages become more language-like, as I was saying, communicative, interactive. And a poster, for example, it was not just a beautiful depiction of something, but it had to convey meaning, it had to have effects. This is a different kind of criteria. And then the diversity of participants were increasing. When you think, again, 100 years ago, there were maybe 50 different kinds of pots produced, and you had that choice. But you didn't have any participation in the kind of pots that were produced. And now we participate in, for example, using iPods, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we are moving from this low diversity industrial culture to a high diversity human-centered design culture. And I will say a little bit more about the notion of design culture, in which the discourse of design is really the important part. So the conclusion here, I would say, the design culture is emerging that enables very ordinary people to participate in the design. If you think again, computer, well, the computer is basically a blank machine, can do anything. There are lots of applications already programmed that you can buy and put in there, but much of it is really your choice how to put it together, what kind of files to put where, and how to organize it. So in that sense, it is really a design activity that comes after the computer is on the market and is in use. So I think there's lots of ordinary design activity involved, and I think one should really acknowledge the fact that in some sense we are all human beings are designers or design things. You know? For example, there is everyday design. Like when you go in the furniture store and you buy your own furniture, then you buy your furniture, you arrange your own living room. That is a design activity, but it's not necessarily one that deals with professional design. Professional design has to go beyond that and dealing with other kind of people. So I would say professional design should enable everyday design to emerge. Or as I say elsewhere, design needs to delegate design. A good design is one that delegates for other people to design, ordinary people to design. I think design is an inherently human quality. If you take it away, I was thinking, how can one take away the ability to design on a very ordinary level? Well, it's probably in prison, where you have to have your own uniform, you're giving your food, you have no choice of these chairs on which you're sitting. This is the most demeaning, from a human point of view, demeaning kind of situation where you cannot do anything. Well, and then there is, of course, another kind of more engineering type of design, also branching perhaps from everyday design, but this deals with technology-driven design. I think when one deals with human-centered design, one feeds back into everyday design. So I think the mechanical, engineering, hardware of computers, that is a technical problem. And I think nowadays, in the industrial area, that was driving actually design. Now it's the other way around, that the interfaces, the desires, what to do with something are dominant, and the technology comes afterwards, and engineers can do amazing things to realize the kind of things that one wishes to do. Now I think when one looks at the role of professional designers from a long time ago, or actually maybe not so long time ago. In fact, I was thinking when I saw some of your things exhibited, what would these graduates do? Would they go to a factory, be hired as designer? Or would they open an own business? I don't know. You have the choice probably. But what can be said in the industrial area, things were hierarchically organized. Designers were hired, and usually they were given technological ideas, something that was worked out, and designers were asked to make a beautiful shape around them, and they had usually some sort of a cultural sensitivity that they brought in, or a sense of what goes, and thereby could aid the new kinds of products, namely that were pleasant in some way. And in a way, pleasant, that was not really the issue. The issue was, during the industrial period, is to expand markets. And to expand markets with mass products, you need to propose or develop a universal aesthetics. And that was actually functionalism, that everyone would like the same thing because it is beautiful in and of itself. But I think this is now, in my opinion, radically has changed into the issue of designers working in design teams, not as celebrated designers. The designers work in networks of others, and designers are not gods that have to do with giving forms, beautiful forms, to ugly technological devices. This is a different kind of way of working nowadays, and I would hope that your education doesn't really provide you only a job as an employee in a company where you are given from an engineer a function and you say, make it a little beautiful, but that you can actually work with other designers and with whole networks of others, and I will talk about stakeholders in a minute. So I think the conclusion is that I think the culturally sensitive genius designer is really more and more outdated. There are, of course, heroes of sorts, but they need to work with others. And again, I'm thinking of Steve Jobs is a good example. Yes, he was head of Apple. Yes, he was a dominant character. Yes, he knew what was to be done, but he could work with other people. He could listen to what was technologically feasible, what user-centered laboratory brought him, and so he was someone who could work in networks of others. So I think that you have that choice, I guess, and as in education, I guess you can move one or the other direction, and I just hope that you don't get stuck in the old industrial conception of design as an employee with some aesthetic capabilities. So, and I think now I want to talk about the role of a professional designer, and I will talk about the consequences of that. I think, again, conventionally, designers have always been somehow the advocates of users. But in fact, designers have very little to say about users. They work with clients. And so, when they talk about users, I have a lot of experiences with it. For example, once we were talking about, actually for Caterpillar, to build cabins for Caterpillar. And so we worked at that time with Reinhard Butter. We talked about the user and how to handle this, and then the guy said, this doesn't matter. We have to convince the buyer who buys 50 pieces. It's not important what the user does. Sure, they learn, but we have a different kind of client. So the client is actually someone who is sent by a company to talk with the designer, but the client has also to work with others. For example, he has to work with the corporate financing, the people that finance. They are kind of gatekeepers of what they negotiate with designers. And then as engineering, something needs to be engineered in order to work. And then there is in the production. Then in the production, there are lots of resources that are being used. And then at that moment, if you see these arrows, the dotted arrows, there's all information, maps, descriptions, instructions that come from designers. And then maybe it becomes somewhat material, but the production goes into marketing, into distribution, and into use. And this is kind of the traditional way for designers to think about all these kind of things until they come to a user. But this is only the beginning of it. Not after the use, there comes things must need to be stored, needs to be kept, needs to be have a social impact or cultural impact. Then they need to be maintained and repaired, and all of these things then they are actually important in the process of designing something. And then they need to be retired or will be retired. And then there is a split between recycling and waste. And so this process continues, and the waste has an effect on the ecology. And so designers ought to really consider all the other factors too. And so what a designer has to think of is these various kinds of what I call stakeholders, each of which has its own domain of interest. And each of them needs to be in some way satisfied. Each of them can be a barrier, or if you want, a gatekeeper. If for example, if the engineers say, well, it can't be engineered, then the good idea that you have is useless. Or if someone says, I can't finance it, this work is not profitable, then you cannot have it done. So a designer has to keep something in motion that goes through the whole cycle. Now, idealizing this a little bit because putting it in the cycle is just convenient. But these are usually complex networks, and part of the design capability is to work with these networks or work in these networks or do something that can survive that network, not the user. So then comes, of course, then also the critic. The critic usually, starts with cultural impact, what that means, a question of ecology, and has a large and use and has a large influence on the distribution or the marketability or sales, or can ruin a product by describing it to be unecological, etc., etc. And these are also things voices that the designer has to consider. So I think this is to me a picture, as I said, much idealized, but it is a complex network of stakeholders that need to be satisfied with anything that you do. And to put just a product on the table and say, this is it, then you basically surrender yourself to the decision making by others. So I think one of the conclusions that I'm drawing from that is the user is a myth. Design takes place in a network of stakeholders. When I say the user is a myth, well, I heard many designers saying, the user wouldn't like this, the user can't handle this. Well, who is the user? There is no such thing as a user. There are many, many users, and there are many, many stakeholders. And these stakeholders have totally different kind of interests. And it is not so that there is a single person that can be singled out as the target of a design. So the second one is that the stakeholders pursue their own interests and live in their own worlds. There is no universal criteria. Everyone has a different kind of criteria. Those people in finance, they want to know, is it profitable? Those people in engineering say, can I really do it? Is it a challenge? Those in marketing saying, can I sell it? And I can give you lots of examples where the selling of something was blocked by marketing, even though I can give you one example. We once made long time ago. I made a workshop in Philips and Eindhoven, and out of this workshop came this famous roll-on radio, which is a radio that had kind of these two loudspeakers. Actually, they started with thinking of drums and then turning these drums because they made noise, etc. And so out of this came this roller radio. And the head of corporate design at Philips liked it so much, and he said, I want it produced. And the marketing said, this is not sellable. This cannot be done. No? So now he was clever enough. He had an Italian friend and showed it to him and said, what do you think of it? And he said, I'm buying 1,000. Okay, so he bypassed marketing and got 1,000 produced, and it became fashionable. It was an icon, and it may not be now anymore around, but this was a way to bypass, in this case, by good argument, marketing, but marketing can be a gatekeeper. And so any design needs to actually satisfy all of these stakeholders that can make decisions. So in each station, look at this, at each station one could say a design has a different manifestation. Now the client representative, they may be getting models, visualizations, the type of things that you exhibit. No? But the client has to now go take this and go to the board, executive board, and say, this is what the designers figured out. How do you like it? And then someone says, oh, my wife doesn't like it. So it's out. So in other words, a designer has to design something that passes through all of these stations. And at each station, the design has a different manifestation. It's not just a product. In the beginning, it's a drawing, then it is a financial plan, then it is an engineering drawing, then it's a production drawing, then it is a marketing plan, then it is somewhere in use, then it is must be stored and kept somewhere, then it has social impact, and all people behind there that have interest in this kind of thing. So the fourth point is that at each point, at each transition of this, there are different kind of meanings. important. So I think it's again a myth to say this means something. It means different things in different situations, different contexts, to different kind of people. And I think a designer needs to anticipate the different kinds of meanings. I say sometimes, it's probably a wrong image or wrong metaphor, we talked about metaphor earlier, that this design has to be like an onion. The first layer is for the first stakeholder, the second layer is for the second, etc., and it must work all the way through. So now, I want to say a few things about meanings, because meanings, we always talk about something has meaning as if the something possesses the meaning in and of itself. I think we, human beings, do not see physical qualities, but what they mean to us. So what does it mean is what they can afford us to do, what we can do with them, how they can affect us, whether they bring us benefits, whether they are dangerous. These are the kind of meanings that are attributed by users, by other people on physical objects, physical properties. Physical properties we do not see. We see the meanings they have from different kinds of people. So I think the consequence is that or one of the things is that meanings are not inherent in the objects, rather than they are acquired in interaction. When you play with something and you start understanding it, then you acquire the meanings of what you can do with it. And so we cannot design meanings into artifacts. That is an illusion which is largely, I think, linguistically supported, that we can design meanings into something we can't, but we can provide affordances. That means possibilities for different kinds of meanings to arise. And we can also prevent certain kinds of meanings from arising, namely meanings that are dangerous. And thinking about, for example, an extreme example, like in the United States, is a big issue, is gun control, that someone doesn't use a gun that he finds on the street, that one could make an affordance that you cannot use a gun unless your fingerprints match that of the owner. So that is a negative affordance or a disaffordance, or once they preventing someone from using a gun that he was not authorized. Or think about a key. A key into a building is allowing you particularly to go in because you have the key, and if you don't have the key, you can't enter. So I think designers need to work on the affordances of what meanings can be attributed and what meanings can be enacted. So I think in that sense, I have looked at different kinds of meanings, or how one could conceptualize meanings, and I basically developed 4 kinds of theories. One, meanings of artifacts in use. That means how one interacts with it, and I will say a little bit more of that. Then there's issue of meanings in language. That many of the meanings are in fact coming from how we speak about them, and then there are some things that are not in language but in use, certain kind of tactile habits that cannot be described in linguistic terms. And then there is language in meanings of artifacts in genesis, in the life history of an object, and there are also some linguistic meanings that cannot be seen as created, and then there's the ecology of artifacts. So let me just talk about meanings in use, and that is kind of the most conventional type of thing. What starts with using an object, an artifact, is usually recognition in some form. And recognition means actually recognition, means actually cognizing it again, finding categories that in which something is. If I don't see something looking like a camera, I will not use it as a camera. If looking something as something totally different, I will use it as what I see it. So recognition, the making objects recognizable, is a very important task. Then the next stage is actually exploration. After you acquire something, because it would would help you to do certain kinds of things, you have to find out where do you put your hand, what kind of buttons you press, with what kind of effects, and that is exploration. And after exploration, after you have tested everything out and you figured out, then it comes actually in a very important stage. In fact, to me, the ultimate stage of use is reliance. And in reliance, you stay in reliance. That means you know the object so well you don't even think about it. It disappears in the background. A good example is the mouse of a computer. Now, you might not, I mean, a total novice will not see that this is a mouse. This is a linguistic description. But nevertheless, we recognize something as a mouse, and then we start exploring things. And then ultimately, we forget them. When we come to reliance, we no longer think of the mouse. We think of what it does. But we become totally unaware of what we are doing. And that is the state of reliance. On the other hand, when we come with a mouse at the edge of a mouse pad and things go wrong, then we recognize that we are actually no longer in reliance. We experience disruptions. And with the disruptions, we go back to exploration. We then look what did wrong, and we find another loop, and then we come back to hopefully reliance. But if that exploration doesn't work out, then we come to simply abandoning the whole project. If we can't handle it, then we lose interest in it, or we cannot use it anymore. So to me, I think meaning and use has all of these kind of features. And let me just mention a few relevant concepts, and there are too many to really read them all. But for example, in terms of recognition, we have category theory, we have the issues of features, dimensions, on typicality of objects, and there are visual metaphors, and they all help to recognize something. And then in exploration, we can use user conceptual models, etc. I don't want to get to this. I know the time is not enough, but there is much more to be done. And in reliance, well, we have kind of the habitual practices that we can engage in, and with habits we don't recognize them anymore. We just do use them. And I think if you think again on the iPad, these hand movements, they are so natural. After a few explanations, you know how to make an image bigger. There's not much explanation. Children do it. Actually, I have grandchildren, and one of them is 2.5 years old, and he says to his mother, "Give me the iPod," and then he finds an application, and he can handle it. I mean, it was not designed for children, but it is so natural that reliance is something they can do without much thinking. So I think this is meaning in use. And in language, it's a little bit more complicated. But in language, I would like to make some general propositions. Namely, I would say the world we know is constructed in the language of our speech communities. That means in our speech community, we have terms for things, we recognize what things are, and so that is very much linguistically determined, and it's not because it's there, but because we have language to talk about it. So, and I wanted to quote a few, three at least. Language, Heidegger said, language is a house of being. That means we develop our own world in the language in which we speak, and we live in that language, and that is our world. And so this is the reason why that's so important. Or Wittgenstein says, speaking a language is a way of life. So I think, well, and then Maturana says here, language is the coordination of action. That means through language we coordinate each other's behavior, and I would say each other's understanding. We coordinate each other's understanding, by talking and have a conversation. And in the end, someone said, "Oh, I understand what you're saying," and then one can move on to another topic. So language has something to do with coordination, and it has also something to do with how we coordinate ourselves with objects. So through language, we coordinate our understanding, including of each other, and how to use objects, artifacts in our world. So I think language to me is a very critical thing. And in language, we may come to understand stakeholders' understanding. And I took this picture earlier about these many stakeholders. I think the only way to understand who they are is by engaging in some form in conversations with them and finding out what their experiences are, what their values are, where their meanings come from, they attribute to their objects, etc. So I think in language, we tend to be confined by categories. And when I said earlier about being assigned usually by technical devices to design something, then someone said, I design a car. Well, a car is a category. What about if one would design transportation, and the transportation of meaning, or something like this? That is a different issue. We are too easily confined in categories. But but there's the reality of things. So we need to understand how categories are formed, how categories determine what we do. And I think when I saw some of the things that you exhibited, many of them had already categories. And so one has to realize that these categories confine yourself in certain kinds of things. And so a common task is actually to avoid categorization that prevent recognition of new uses. Or another issue is language. In language, we attribute characters. Something is fast, something is slow, something is beautiful, something is ugly. These are all attributes that we impose on objects, and we have good reasons to do so, but in language they come about. And in fact, much of aesthetics is not a separate discipline, it really occurs in language. Aesthetics is a linguistic practice. So I think a common task for designers is actually to develop something that doesn't fall into the existing attribute space or it changes into a new kind of attribution, and aesthetic judgments are just one of them. So in language also we instruct each other. I think this is to me important, the whole notion of narrative, that we create understanding by walking people through what something does. So a common task is, for example, to design an artifact that corresponds to the kind of narrative we can use in order to explain it. I did once an exercise and to design actually some means of transportation, and I said, start with the narrative. From where to where you want to go, or what you want to do, what you want to take with you, etc., etc. And then became increasingly detailed in the kind of narrative that one could use in order to explain this. And in the end, there's some way came out to a design that could in fact help. So in language also we explain disruptions and we blame. We blame, for example, as bad workmanship, or someone tried to harm me, or this computer doesn't like me, and all of these kind of things. This is all in language, and then we have to explore just what kind of explanations do people use in order to explain disruptions of sorts, and out of that we can learn actually how to bypass them and make in fact the disruption a positive thing, and saying, gee, I made a mistake and now I know better. This is a better thing than just blaming something. And these kind of things occur all in language. So I think I was saying a common assignment is to encourage explanation that support learning. And so so the relevant concepts, and there are so many, I don't want to all read it. I know that the time is almost getting up, but believe me, there are lots of things that you can learn and look into it. Now, I want to now talk about the meaning of life in the life of artifacts. And I gave you this picture before. And what actually happens here is that a design is not, nobody designs products. This is a big myth. Again, designers design instructions, design explanations, make models, proposals, suggestions. And these suggestions, they must move through that whole process, through the whole networks. And I gave you already a bit of an explanation of this, but I think the issue is that designers need to make something that is a proposal. Now we know a proposal must travel basically through this whole network. If it is stopped somewhere, as I was saying earlier, then it is not working. So at each stage, a design must make sense, has desirable meaning, and provide value for the stakeholders. Now, I think one of the sentences that I always say, the fate of any design is decided in the language of its stakeholders. And I think that this is something you can burn in your heart. Any stakeholder, by stakeholder actually I mean someone who has a stake in the matter. By stake one could translate as an interest. Someone who has a stake, saying a claim, someone who says that I need to be consulted, and that can be positive or negative. It can be positive by saying, I want to be part of that project and do my thing. It can be also negative by saying, you better don't do this, it's unecological, and I will do everything I can to prevent this from happening. These are stakeholders. And I think any design needs to pass through the network of its stakeholders, and if it doesn't, it will not succeed. So, but I think what I often do is I talk about, actually there is one good theory, the speech act theory. And speech act theory deals actually with the kind of information that needs to be in the act of proposing things. And in this case, a proposal, in my opinion, needs to inform recipients of the overall purpose, suggest possibilities for action, as well as attractive rewards and for the work to be done. These are so-called essential conditions. Then there's another kind of condition, the preparatory condition, namely any proposal needs to address needs to be commensurate or needs to address the kind of things that a recipient has available. If the recipient has no money, no production facilities, no capabilities of translating something, it isn't a satisfactory proposal. And then it has to be adequate backing. That means there has to be some sort of evidence, and I will talk in a minute about this, that this is a sincere proposal, not just a joke. And by sincere, I mean there has to be some sort of evidence, some evaluation to say that this is, if you follow my suggestion, you will get a real product out of it, you get your money back, etc., etc. And finally, any proposal, and that is one, if you want a contractual condition, needs to enroll stakeholders in the designer's project. That means if it doesn't excite these stakeholders as to be part of that, then it won't be done. So that these are the kind of the speech act conditions of a proposal. And I think if I will invite you to maybe go through this exhibition again and ask yourself, does it tell me what I can do with it? Does it tell me how much money I can make from it? How many people I can employ? Does it tell me, is there any evidence that it is useful? So these are the kind of things that I think any designer needs to be built in what a designer gives off to the others. So I think designers that do not satisfy these conditions are unlikely to succeed unless, and this is the unfortunate part, other stakeholders make them their own. And it's very often so that if a great idea that you have and you give it to someone and they say, oh, this is very interesting, but we do something else about it, fine, thank you. But I think a designer ought not to be just a generator of ideas, and a designer needs to be making it real and making it possible that something comes of it. So I think a prerequisite, actually, of being able to do that, being able to formulate proposals that satisfy all of these conditions, is an understanding and a respecting of diverse understandings by others, by stakeholders. And I will briefly talk about that. To me, I call it a second order understanding. The understanding of understanding, the understanding of others' understanding, and respecting it. Again, in my experiences with design students, I often say, take this and show it to someone, and they say, can come back and saying, oh, they don't understand. Well, they don't understand. Well, what does it mean? That means you have, in a way, failed to make it attractive, to be understood. And then it comes, oh, they are stupid, they don't know anything about design. But the point is actually, as designers, you can't afford this arrogant attitude and saying, I'm the one who determines what the meaning is. I think you have to learn to understand the understanding of others and respect them for their differences. And then do something that is enabling them to make use of it in ways that is helpful to them. So I think there are 4 ways of incorporating second-order understanding in a design process. The obvious but maybe more difficult way is to have that understanding, to have that second-order understanding, to be acquainted with their relevant stakeholders, to have a sense of who they are. But this is often very difficult because designers, after all, you're going to a university, you are trained, you're necessarily different from other people, engineers and users and salespeople. You are not that. So it's very difficult to be fully cognizant of the understanding of others' understanding. So a second way is by inquiring into it, by doing research, by doing ethnography, survey research, interviews, observational studies, taking videos, etc., etc. So that is a second way. But a third way is, and I think in Sweden is particularly, I would say, I wanted to say fashionable, but I don't mean it in a negative way. I think Swedish designers are on the forefront of actually doing cooperative design, which imports, in a way, the second-order understanding in the design process. You don't need to have it, but you need to be open to work with others in order to do something that is useful for them. And for that, there are numerous ways of doing it, and you can learn that. Actually, I think to me that is an important part of the learning experience of designers is to do group work, to find ways of getting leading stakeholders involved in the design process. That is not easy. But I think this is the third way. The fourth one is actually to test the consequences of second-order understanding. Wherever you got it, in the end, you have to test as a possibility, and then you can see whether that was indeed obtained. So I think this is to me, I think, one important way of getting somehow the meaning of others into the design process. And then I think I want to only very briefly talk about the ecology of other artifacts. But I think to me an ecology is a diverse, self-reproducing, I mean ecology is actually in biology is a multiplicity of species that interact with each other and determine their livelihood in some form. I think the same thing is also with artifacts. When you design an artifact that enters an ecology of other artifacts, is connected with others. You know, you plug in the computer, you buy an application. These are all different artifacts, but they have to hang together. And there are several kind of parallels, one could say, between language and the ecology of artifacts. One of which is that synonymous words, of course, in language are substitutable for each other. Well, there are synonyms of artifacts also that are substitute, where people can buy one or the other and use either of them, and then it's a question of which of the species will survive. No? Then is the issue of artifacts form whole family resemblances. Family resemblances in the sense of, for example, belonging together. Furniture is a kind of a category which has a family resemblance of, there's chairs and tables and sofas and whatever. They're independent objects, but they are purchased together, or tableware and forks and knives, and so they are purchased together. They are independent objects, but they support each other. There are other artifacts that form larger corporations. For example, a massive example is a car. A car is actually a very dominant species. It has an amazing number of industries supporting it, from gasoline stations to the oil industry, to repair places, to gadgets that you can buy, tires that you can mount, tools you can buy, and it has it has built or forced us to abandon our way of living in favor of big streets. If you look at Los Angeles, this is the result of actually, in this case, a very dominant type of artifacts moving into becoming a dominant species and absorbing all the others around. So I think these artifacts, they need to be, the meaning of these artifacts in the ecology of artifacts is how they interact with each other, what kind of cooperatives they form, what kind of competition they form. And I think, if you don't think about those type of things, other people will. And I have to say also, stakeholders usually don't deal with those issues. The ecology of artifacts is in some sense unlike the ecology of biological species. Biological species interact by themselves. The artifacts, they are animated by the users, by many people doing things with it. So it's a bit of a difference. But I think this is a very local, most of the stakeholders have a very local kind of conception that I buy myself a computer and now I'm happy with that computer. But from a designer's point of view, if you design a computer, you have to see what other computers are available, what other kind of peripherals are available, what do I kill off and what do I support it with. So this is, I think, the meaning of artifacts in ecology. So I think there's much to be done in the way of inquiring into the way meanings are being attributed to objects. And for example, there are preparatory methods, and I see the time is up almost, but eliciting stakeholders' narratives, asking them what kind of stories of their life can they tell you, and particularly of failures. These are the type of ways of expanding the space of possibilities before you get into a design. And then in the design process, there are questions, there are ways of methods of creating spaces of possible futures. There are brainstorming, reframing, etc., etc. And then there is issue of evaluation. And I think to me that I said earlier about backing, I think this is something that is unfortunately very little done, and mainly because I think we have a very narrow conception of design. When we deal with issues of meaning, it opens up possibilities for evaluating the claims that we make. So there are several kinds of validity that we can employ, and I should like to say this is very fundamentally different, this form of validity from, for example, the natural sciences. In the natural sciences, we can collect data. We asked how the data support a theory, and then we can say the theory is validated or not. But designs deal always with the future. And in the future, we don't have yet any data. So what the kind of validation that we have available are slightly different kinds, one of which is demonstration. And I think I saw in the exhibition several demonstrations, pictures of use. You can make videos, how one does something, showing a model. And so that these are all demonstrations. Then there is the issue of experimental type of validity, where you take a part that is not so clear whether it would work, and you make an experiment with it, and you can present the data as an evidence that this might work. And then there is the issue of, I think, the methodological validity. To me, is that it's very important. If you present a design and simply say, "Oh, this is what I came up with," then it's very easy for a stakeholder to say, "So what? There could be other opportunities." But if you can say, "I have explored these 20 different alternatives and have discounted this for this reason, discounted that for this reason, and I came up with one." This is a methodological validity which is very powerful because it can show that you have done work, that you have done, made your selection, and that is a powerful argument. And finally, there is a pragmatic validity. And the pragmatic validity, and I mentioned earlier, this is perhaps a good example with the roller radio. No? If you have in your pocket stakeholders that say, I want to have it, then you don't need to show anything else. That is the best pragmatic validity of your design. You don't need to argue very much. You don't need to show methods, etc., etc. You can say, this works because I have commitments from stakeholders. But I think the point is actually that these kind of methods of inquiry are absolutely necessary for making design a more respectable type of profession. So, and I wanted to make again the point that I made in passing, that unlike inquiries in the natural sciences, the evaluation of a design it pertains always to future issues. That is an epistemological problem. How could you have evidence for something in the future that has not yet been observed? So the ultimate proof of the validity of a design lies always in the realization of stakeholders. That means after the fact, it is very easy to say that that was a successful design. But before that, you can't. You have to use these 4 methods of evaluation that I mentioned. I think there is very little done, but I think this is again what the university can do, I think very well, is what I call, or what other people call, post-design research. Learning actually from how people design something, which methods were used, and what happens when they came through the network of stakeholders. How did they get stuck? How did they succeed? And then you learn from that for the next time. So this is, to me, I think, a very important area that actually the university can do best in order to improve, basically, the design process. So I think this, to me, I think is the starting point of a science for design. And my hope is that this will be not just about design. There's a whole area of study, for example, when psychologists study designers, they study from the outside, no? Or that is about design, or not of design, but for design. That means a methodology or a research that is done by designers for the purpose of improving the design process or the design discourse. And I think with this I can stop and say, I hope that, or I can have one more, and I say I would like to have your questions, and if you have any arguments, I'm more than pleased to discuss them.